Well, like practically every teenager back on February 9th, 1964, I was watching The Ed Sullivan Show, and that's where I saw them for the very first time. And I was immediately hooked. I just thought they were so amazing. And so during the next few months, all of my friends were becoming Beatle fans as well. And so I just decided I really want to see them perform.
Yeah.
So when I found out they were coming back to the United States for their first major tour in the summer, I got a little depressed because I was living in North Dakota and I knew they weren't going to be performing anywhere close to my hometown there. And my mother said that if I could get tickets to any venue, she would take me there to see the Beatles, which was really unusual back then because there were a lot of mothers that were saying, no, I don't want you to have anything to do with the Beatles. They're a bad influence. But my mother saw how important they were to me. And so
Why were they considered a bad influence? That's interesting.
well, because I guess the girls were screaming at their concerts, and I can't understand it because they were so clean cut.
Yeah, maybe it was like
So it
ladylike
made
behavior or something.
it really made no sense whatsoever that mothers wouldn't like it. But when I speak to other people and I tell them how my mom said that she would take me anywhere to see them, they come back and say, oh, my mom wouldn't let me go near them. So I was really lucky in that respect.
So what'd she do? What did
and-
your mom do?
So actually what I did,
Oh, you did.
I mean, these days, if you want to find out a band's schedule, you just go on the internet and they list every place where they're going to be playing. Well, back then, I wrote a letter to Capitol Records and asked them if I could get a copy of their tour schedule. And I sent a self-addressed stamped envelope and it came back to me and I had all of the venues. So I sat down and I wrote letters to maybe 5 or 6 places that were close. And I kept getting answers back that it was sold out, including Seattle. So it was sold out, but there were tickets available in Vancouver, British Columbia. So we bought the tickets, and fortunately, my grandmother lived in Oregon at the time, so it made sense to do a road trip out here. So my mother and my sister and I came out to the West Coast.
Did you fly?
We drove. We drove a 1963 Dodge Polara. I still remember that. And before we left, my mom had friends living here in Seattle that she wanted to visit. And her friends said, well, the Beatles are going to be are going to be playing here the night before they're in Vancouver, and they're staying at the Edgewood Inn hotel. So my mother made a reservation for us to stay here at the hotel. And we actually arrived the day before the Beatles came. Once we arrived and we'd been here the first day, the manager called my mother down to his office and he said, I'm really embarrassed, but we're going to have to find you other accommodations.
Why?
Because according to their insurance contract, there weren't supposed to be any teenagers staying here at the hotel. But my mother assured them that we wouldn't be any problems, so they relented and let us stay.
So just specifically the insurance contract that was for the Beatles.
Was for the
They didn't
Beatles.
want any
Oh,
teenagers.
oh, yes, because they'd be destructive. Not only that, but they would hide in laundry baskets. And this hotel was particularly good because 3 sides of it are surrounded by water. But the very main entrance there in the front, by the time we arrived, they'd already put up a barricade, plywood barricade with barbed wire, as I recalled. And the fans started arriving early the morning that the Beatles were supposed to get there. They were lined up waiting for them to come.
Wow.
Yeah.
So your mom
Yeah.
basically convinced the hotel
It said that
manager.
we would be, and we were. My sister was 2 years older than I, and we weren't the screaming type. You know, it was something that that just wasn't the way that we reacted at all
Yeah.
to
So
them.
I'm surprised they made an exception though. That's great.
Yes, that they did, absolutely. They did say that we were supposed to stay in our rooms, which we did, but our room was facing the courtyard, so we had a beautiful view of the front entrance. And we did sit there and we waited all afternoon, and finally at 4:02 p.m., we heard the screams and the limousine came driving into the hotel. And to me, that was just so exciting. I couldn't believe that I was actually seeing the limousine that was carrying the Beatles. And to me, that was well worth the trip right there. But it got better.
That was just the beginning.
That was just the beginning, and it just kept getting better and better and better from there. It was just packed, absolutely packed with people wanting to see them because they had no other choice. There were people that had rented boats or somehow were driving in boats along the water hoping to get a glimpse of them, but for the most part, that was the only place where they could see them when they arrived.
Yeah,
was there in the front, yes.
So you're like,
Yeah.
wow, you're at the center of all this hoopla.
Yes, absolutely,
And
absolutely.
you didn't see them go in.
No,
But that night they played here, right?
yeah,
no?
well, they played, yes, at the Coliseum, but that afternoon, after they had arrived, I was walking around the hotel and I heard all of these men talking in British accents. And there was one who seemed kind of approachable. He was an older gentleman and he kind of looked like Winston Churchill. So I went up to him and I struck up a conversation. And
Which for a 16-year-old to do that to an older man.
I was pretty confident back then. I was, you know, I figured I wanted to learn as much about the Beatles as I could, and when I hear British accents, it's like, go up and talk to them.
Yeah.
So I approached him, and sure enough, his name was George Harrison, but he was no relation to the Beatle George. He was a columnist for the Liverpool Echo, and he was traveling with them on tour. So we just struck up a conversation, and he was very kind, and I think he was impressed by the fact that my mother had driven halfway across the continent so that I could come and see the Beatles. So he pulled out the Beatles schedule from his pocket, and he said, well, if you go down to the cafe at 6:30, that's when they're going to be leaving the hotel to go to the concert. And so sure enough, my mother, my sister, and I went down there, and there was a window that actually overlooked where they were getting in the limousine. And we sat there and waited, and that's when I got the first really close-up glimpse of them getting into the car to go to the concert. They were only like 5 feet away. There was just the window in between. So that was really, really exciting right there. Remember, we did not have tickets to see them perform. So we saw them leave, and to me, that was as good as it gets. I thought, nothing's going to get any better than that. So that evening we'd had dinner here at the hotel, and once again we ran into Mr. Harrison, the columnist, because apparently he wouldn't go to all the shows. He would just stay back at the hotel, and then he'd get a report and he'd write his column on it. So he was there at the hotel, and there was actually a lot of other adults that we were all sitting around in the area down in the lobby talking, and he mentioned how he was in the process of writing a book about the Beatles, and he had a lot of personal photographs and some of their original schoolwork. And he invited this whole group, and as I said, it was mainly adults. He invited us up to his room to show us all of these things, and it was fascinating. I mean, to see personal pictures that he'd taken of the Beatles, and he even showed me a paper from high school that Paul McCartney had written. It was his analysis of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and it had James P. McCartney written all over it. So that was just so exciting right there. And while all of us were there in the room, the phone rang, and it was Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager, and he was calling to report on the performance because, as I said, he didn't always go there. So Brian would call him and tell him what had happened there at the show, so he'd have something to write about in his column, because it was a daily column that he would post for the Liverpool Echo. So we were hearing just one side of the conversation, and it was just starting to wrap up, and he said, "I've got a 16-year-old girl here, and I was wondering if she could come down and meet the boys." And
Did you
at
know
that
he was
point,
going to say that?
absolutely not. And I have to tell you, Maddie, that by this time, I had been so happy just to see them leave the hotel. To me, that was as good as it was going to get. And so this came totally out of left field. And I couldn't hear the other end of the conversation, but I'm guessing he probably said, "Oh, they just want to relax. They came back from the concert in an ambulance." But he said, "Well, it's only one, and it'll just be for a few minutes." And he hung up the phone, and he looked at me, and he said, "You're in." At which point, I just got knots in my stomach. But my sister was also there, and then there was another couple from Oregon. They had a couple of children that were already in bed, but the father said, "Oh, let me go down and get my children so they could go too." So there was a little bit of a controversy going on there. And finally it was decided that it was just going to be me that would go down there, because that's what he said. So
yeah, he had to honor that.
Yes, he honored that.
He probably had to tell us other people no.
Right, yeah.
Sorry.
Yes,
I'm
yeah.
here.
Yeah, and even my sister, I mean, she wasn't that much of a Beatles fan. So as we were walking out the room, she looked at Mr. Harrison and she said, "Thank you for doing this for my sister." Yeah, which was really sweet.
That makes me want to cry. That's so sweet.
It was, yeah, because she was just so happy. Because the whole reason for that trip was to go out to see the Beatles, and I had instigated the whole thing. So
she knew how
so she knew how important it was to me. Yeah. We walked out and we got in the elevator because I think we were on the 3rd floor maybe. So I remember riding down in the elevator, and it was absolutely surreal thinking that I was on my way to meet them. And we got to the room here, and he knocked on the door. There was a security person sitting on a chair right outside the door. And Brian opened the door, and Paul was standing right behind him. So he was the first Beatle that I saw. Yes, yes. So they invited me in. I did. I was really pretty cool. I was cool because I think I was probably in such a state of shock that I didn't really realize it was happening. So we came in the room here, and George was on a couch over in that area. And so Paul took me over, and introduced me to George, and so the two of us were talking for a while. John was over on probably right about this area, sitting.
What did the conversation? What was the first thing you said to Paul? Like, take me back to like that first moment with Paul.
I wish I could remember.
Okay.
I honestly wish I could.
Yeah. You just met him,
Yeah. I just remember snippets of conversation. I remember saying to him that my favorite song was, "Do you want to know a secret?" And he said, "Oh, it has nice words." So it's just little snippets like that. I wish I would have written more down afterwards, because it was, as I said, you're in a room with the Beatles, and your mind is just like scrambled eggs. I mean, it really is. So,
I totally get that.
yes. And I was also asking them about how the tour was going because they had just arrived. They'd only done a couple of dates. And as I mentioned, John was right about in this area, and he had his sunglasses on and that hat that he always used to wear back in the early 60s, and he was reading a room service menu. So he was just kind of ignoring me at first. And then eventually Paul took me over and introduced me to him. And the one thing I do remember is when he heard that I was from North Dakota, he said, "Oh, the Black Hills of the Dakotas." And at the time I was just so impressed that he had heard of where I was from.
Yeah.
Yes.
He wasn't ever
Yeah,
from the
yes,
US,
because North Dakota and England, who's really hurt. So anyway, and Ringo was in another room. He was right over in this area, and he was taking a shower. So I didn't see him right away. When I was down in the coffee shop, and after the Beatles had left for the hotel, one of the waitresses, she could see I was just very emotional, and she came up and she said, "Oh, we just delivered room service." And the tray just came back, and she gave me she said, "Paul McCartney ate his dinner off this fork," and gave me the fork. Well, who knows if that was true or not, but she gave it. But she also got a placemat, and she wrote down Ringo's room number, which was, I believe, 274, and she circled it on this placemat. I've got that in my scrapbook that I can show you.
So what was this room like?
This was just strictly a hospitality suite. There was no bed in. It was nothing. They had a bar set up in this area with some bar stools. There were a couple of couches. There were chairs along the side. And then there was obviously a bathroom back there because Ringo wasn't taking a shower. But this was just where they probably had a lot of people that would come and meet them, maybe advertisers, who knows.
Sure.
But they'd have a suite
space,
set.
yeah.
Just a private. But they each had their own individual rooms. None of them, and maybe I shouldn't be revealing this, none of them actually stayed in this room. But they did go fishing from that window.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's the window.
Yeah.
Wait.
Yeah.
Okay. So take me back
Okay.
kind of to you're in the suite.
Yeah.
You meet Paul. You meet George. No.
George and Paul.
John.
George and Paul. We were over sort of in that area.
Okay.
Talking for several minutes. Then they brought me over, introduced me to John.
Black
Pretty
Hills of the
soon,
Dakotas.
Ringo came out, and he was rubbing his hair with a towel. So I went over and talked to him, and of course, I asked him, "So where did you get all the rings?" So he went through each of the rings he was wearing and explained where he'd gotten them. And then at the very end, we were all sort of sitting around the bar area, and they were talking about the upcoming tour. And at the time, there had been a psychic who had predicted that their plane was going to crash on the way to their Indianapolis concert. So there was some discussion among them about what they should do, whether they should, cancel the concert, go there by train, but then they just decided no, they were just going to go ahead. And fortunately, the psychic was wrong.
Gosh,
Yes.
wow, that's an interesting
Yeah, but that
conversation
was
to
the one conversation I remember them all talking about, because it was something that had just come out that day, that I believe her name was Jean Dixon,
Oh, okay.
and she had predicted that their plane was going to crash on.
You never, people are
yeah.
going to say anything
Yeah.
about what you do when you're that famous.
Yes, yes. So that was the one thing that I remembered. And then I had a copy. I had seen the movie A Hard Day's Night a few days earlier, and I had purchased a paperback, a copy of the book. And I'd been reading it that afternoon here at the hotel. And so it just happened to be in my purse. And so I had all of them autograph the book. Yes. So that was something else that was going on while I was here in the room, is that they were autographing the book.
Yeah.
Yes.
And did
Yeah.
they offer you a drink or anything like that?
I remember
Smoke?
Paul offered me a cigarette, and I turned it down because I didn't smoke. But I was 16, so they didn't offer me a drink. And obviously they were drinking, but they may have offered me a Coke, I don't know. But I remember distinctly Paul offering me a cigarette, and I really wish I would have taken it now just to have as a souvenir.